my cousin wrote a letter on a long strip of cigarette paper. People used to roll their cigarettes in those days. And he wrote it in pencil, and they rolled it up, and this German soldier put it in a cigarette holder, and that's how he smuggled it out. He found us through the Red Cross, and he actually sent this letter. And I so remember my father reading it to us, and my mother crying as he read the news, because that was the first time we found out in 5 years that, number one, her parents were dead. We had other family members that had died, and the circumstances. And he ended this letter with an exhortation for all of us in the West to do everything possible so that Lithuania could be free again. And he concluded with greetings to all of us, quote, "In the name of the nest which longs for you." I actually have that letter to this day. It's almost like a little museum piece, if you want to see it. This was it. We really treasure it.
So when and why did you end up leaving Germany then?
Well, Germany after the war was totally devastated, and it had its millions of its own inhabitants were refugees in their own country, displaced, in other words, from various parts. Plus it had tens of millions of refugees from East and Central Europe. Among those, there were about tens of thousands of Lithuanians. So there was no life in Germany at that time. And of course, during those war years and the 5 years thereafter, we always had this hope that even on New Year's we used to toast and say, "Next year in a free Lithuania." But then came the Yalta Conference, and during the Yalta Conference the Baltic states were actually ceded to the Soviet Union, and it was no longer an option that we would ever go back to a free Lithuania. There also was fear of repatriation to the Soviet Union, because the Slavic peoples like the Ukrainians, Croats, Belarusians, they were actually forcibly repatriated against their will to the Soviet Union. But the Balts were not, the Baltic peoples were not, because neither the United States nor the United Kingdom recognized the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union. Eventually, many countries, including the United States, opened up their borders for immigration, for refugees. If you had a sponsor, you could go to the United States. And my grandmother had some friends from way back before the war who had immigrated in the early 1900s to Chicago. And we reconnected again with them through the Red Cross, and they sponsored us. So the only thing was to leave Germany, leave Europe, and go to the US.
So what were your first impressions of the United States when you first immigrated?
Well, we came to Chicago because that's where our sponsors lived. And remember, I was almost 10 years old, so a kid at age 10 sees life as quite an adventure. And so my initial impressions were a lot of fun. The sponsors had a granddaughter who was kind of my age. They took me on certain trips. They took me to the amusement park. They took me to the beach. They took me shopping at like a 5 and 10, which was a big experience. And then another family that were also friends of my grandmother, they weren't our sponsors, were so totally kind. They set up our first apartment in the Bridgeport area. It was a very small apartment. It was a basement apartment, but it was ours and it was private. And they totally furnished it with everything. They had, linens in the linen closet and food in the pantry for us. And my mother's one big impression was when we walked in and the table was covered with a white tablecloth, and on it was even a little toothpick holder with little toothpicks in it. I mean, down to that last detail, they made us feel so at home. I started school in a Lithuanian parochial school. It was run by an order of Lithuanian nuns, and they could still speak Lithuanian, so it was a very good transition. But in a matter of 4 or 5 months, we literally learned fluent English because of the surroundings. It was also a neat transition for me because my best friend from the DP camp in Kempton emigrated to Chicago too, kind of lived in the neighborhood and went to the same school. So the continuity was there, and that meant a lot. Now, not all immigrants were that lucky. I mean, some really
How would you then describe the Lithuanian immigrant experience in America?
Well, I think that the experiences were as different as there were immigrants. I mean, as I said, for people who immigrated at like my age, the grade school age, we adjusted to life in the U.S. We immediately learned the language, and we went on with our life. You know, I went through high school, college, and had a normal life. It was more difficult, I think, for the generation that was like my cousin, who had just finished DP high school in Germany, and the moment she came to this side of the ocean, she had to work, and her life was kind of, well, changed a lot by that. But for adults, for some of them, it was very, very difficult, I think for the majority, because they came not knowing the language, and their credentials, for those who were professional, their credentials weren't accepted. And so they ended up doing any kind of work just to make ends meet. They became, you know, laborers, factory workers, gas station attendants. Whereby before they may have been professors in college. So I think, but many of them, after they learned the language, and some were able to actually upgrade themselves more in their, you know, professional field. So I believe that the immigrants' experiences were very difficult, but we adjusted. The one thing I want to mention, though, about the Lithuanians, just like in the DP camps, we set up our schools and our choirs and everything else. The Lithuanian communities here in the States did the same. We had our Saturday school for the kids, and we had a lot of cultural organizations and everything else like that. Even political parties were reborn that had been, you know, existed in free Lithuania. And so these people, these adults, they actually lived this double life. Monday through Friday, they went to whatever their jobs were to earn a living. And then on weekends, they lived this pseudo-existence of pre-war Lithuania.
Did you maintain your Lithuanian heritage in the United States?
Yes, I did. When, as I said, when we first settled in Chicago, we lived in, you know, Lithuanian clusters. So we had a lot of things, especially on weekends, that were Lithuanian. But even though I actually moved from Chicago when I was in 7th grade, and we moved to St. Charles, where there were only 3 other Lithuanian families. And there I got to readjust all over again to life, because now I did not have my Lithuanian support group. But even living outside Chicago and living, and even eventually when I married a non-Lithuanian, those traditions and my language were very important to me, and I did maintain it. And I've maintained my Lithuanian traditions, even passed them on to a 3rd generation by now.
So did you ever actually go back to Lithuania after coming here?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union was sort of liberalizing itself more under Khrushchev, and they allowed tourism into Lithuania, but you had to go through these approved agencies, and you had to fly into Moscow, and there you left your documents, and then they would fly you to Lithuania, which was going 800 kilometers backwards, and you could spend a limited time there, for example, 5 days only, in an approved hotel. You were not allowed to stay in your relatives' or friends' homes, but you could see your family and visit them during the day. So my mother actually went back to Lithuania in 1981, which was very unusual, with one of these tour groups. And she saw her sister for the first time in 37 years. Her sister had been deported to Siberia, but by that time the family had been returned to Lithuania. And she came back with all kinds of stories and, of course, some pictures and everything else. And I really, really wanted to go back to see the land of my birth, because I actually never thought I would live to see a free Lithuania in my lifetime. So in 1987, my cousin and I went back together. The reason I wanted her to go with me is because she had immigrated she left Lithuania when she was 13, so she really remembered it. And I left it when I was 4, and I remembered very small, you know, insignificant things. So we went back together and we reconnected with the family. And it was a very poignant experience. I felt like I really belonged there, and yet I didn't, because life was so different.
So what was the new Russia-occupied Lithuania like?
as we flew into Lithuania, I must say, from Moscow, they flew into the capital city, Vilnius, and it's along the river banks. And as I looked out the window, I could see and recognize the historical buildings because I had seen pictures of them all my life in some books that we had about Lithuania. And I thought, oh my gosh, I can recognize the castle and the cathedral and St. Anne's Church and things like that. It was so unreal. We couldn't take pictures. They didn't allow us to use cameras from the plane. So in a way, I knew I was going to some place that I, so to speak, knew, although I didn't know. Once we got there, I realized that, it was very regimented. Most of the churches were closed and they were like museums or warehouses or something. The buildings were very shabby, peeling paint, really shabby. The people maintained their apartments nicely in these huge multi-family buildings that had been built by the Soviets, but the outside was awful looking and there was no landscaping. It was just like the slums, like a housing project. On the other hand, the countryside, the little we saw, was very beautiful, very green, with these rolling hills and forests and stuff. And it just didn't match the city, and the fact that people were not free to talk to you. We used to talk only like in the parks or in their apartments sometimes, but never anywhere we thought, like in the hotel, we never conversed because you didn't know if there were listening devices.
Did you ever go back after that initial first trip?
Yes, I went back in '89, which was in the time of Glasnost, and incredibly, we still had to fly into Moscow, but we were allowed to keep our passports, and when we got to Lithuania, although we still had to pay the in-tourist fee to the hotel, we never stayed in the hotel. We were allowed to stay with our relatives. They took us around. They even took us as far as Palanga, on the Baltic coast, because we had relatives living there. And so you could really feel the freedom. And they had, the old flag was instituted again, and you could see it flying from the castle in Vilnius, the yellow, green, and red Lithuanian flag. It was just a totally different experience. You could really feel the rebirth. And after that, after independence, I've been back many times. I've been back with family members too.
And do you see it changing?
Oh heavens, yes. Now of course it's a member of the European Union, and it's just a modern Western country. The old town is maintained beautifully now. All these buildings have been repainted and remodeled, and then they've got all these, they've got malls. They've got things like we have in the West. Fantastic supermarkets and all that, and it's just, and of course, people are free to come and go. They can come to the States, they can visit us. Our relatives have visited us here from Lithuania, whereby in the past and it all happened in my lifetime, so it's kind of nice.
How do you think your values have been formed by your experiences through your war experiences and your experiences as an immigrant?
I think they have definitely formed very pacifist views in me. I think that war is a horrible, cruel, and totally useless endeavor. It doesn't solve anything, and it causes immense problems. On the other hand, because of all of my experiences there, and especially like the family that was so kind to set up our first apartment, I think I tried to emulate them by being cognizant there are many people who are less fortunate than I, and within my means to help them. I'm also less wasteful. I recycle a lot. I repurpose things a lot. That's just part of my value system. I think I try to change just my little corner of the world because I can't influence the whole world. But that's how I think my previous life, my life during the war and in the DP camp and all that, and the immigration process has formed me.